Welcome back. Here we go again. Next topic is aggression, and this is one of those topics that seems to fit nicely into social psychology. So let's see. Our last topics have been low self-esteem, and then prejudice, and then conformity and obedience to an authority figure, and now aggression. It's often at this point in time in the semester that students wonder, geez, don't they ever talk about anything nice in social psychology? I can see that it would start to look that way. But I will say this, the next topic after aggression is helping behavior. That's the good news. The bad news is that's often a discussion of why people won't help. Anyway, back to our topic of aggression. What we'll first do is we'll look at some definitions of aggression and then talk about specific types of aggression. And then we'll spend the rest of the time looking at an overall model of aggression. This model of aggression will include both personal and situational factors that influence aggression, and also includes psychophysiological states that impact aggression. Sit back, relax, here we go again. Aggression involves the intent to physically or verbally harm someone who is motivated to avoid that treatment, and/or the physical destruction of property when motivated by anger. There are two types of aggression that we can talk about. One type of aggression is called hostile aggression. Hostile aggression involves acts that are designed to harm, for which the goal is the physical or psychological pain and suffering of the target. For hostile aggression, or what is sometimes called affective or angry aggression, the whole purpose of this act is to make someone suffer. The second type of aggression, instrumental aggression, involves acts designed to harm, for which the goal is something other than the psychological and/or physical pain and suffering of the target. Essentially, with instrumental aggression, the act is used as a means to an end. So for our example of hostile and instrumental aggression, let's take a look at what was happening in the early days of the hitting of the coronavirus in the spring of 2020. The first couple of days when this was becoming clear that it was a pandemic and it was a major crisis and issue, there was a run on toilet paper. Everybody was after toilet paper. Nobody cared about eggs or meat or clean water. Everybody just wanted toilet paper. And stores would run out of this very quickly. So let's say that Walmart says, oh my gosh, we actually got in a shipment of toilet paper. And so everyone runs to Walmart and grabs toilet paper. And by the time somebody gets there, there's only two left, right? There's only two packages of toilet paper left. And they get there at the exact same time that somebody else gets there, but the other person reaches and grabs both packages. So instead of giving one to one person and taking the other, they take both packages of toilet paper. Let's say the person that stands there and watches this person do this grabs the person by the neck and chokes him and pushes him down. Now that could be hostile or instrumental aggression. It could be hostile aggression if they're just like, I cannot believe you're such a dick and you took all the toilet paper and all I want to do is cause you pain and suffering. I just want you to suffer and to feel pain and to feel my wrath. But it could also be instrumental aggression. They could be thinking, I'm going to choke this person and throw him down and then grab the toilet paper. It's not that I really wanted to hurt the person per se. I mean, I knew I was going to hurt them. But what I was really after was the toilet paper, not their pain and their suffering. Our examination of aggression will be framed within the general aggression model developed by Anderson in the 1990s. The general aggression model is a comprehensive theoretical approach to understanding aggression. One of the problems with research and theory historically on aggression was that it was fragmented. There were pieces here and pieces there. There were topics here and there were topics there. There wasn't a concise overall global picture of the process of aggression. The general aggression model is comprehensive and incorporates most of these fragments into one framework for understanding why humans act aggressively. A diagram of the general aggression model appears on the following slide, and then slides after that will involve descriptions of the model as well as the specific components of the model. A second general point that needs to be made is whether or not this model, the general aggression model, argues for a direct or indirect relationship between the personal and situational input variables and aggression. And if you look again back at the model, at the diagram on the previous slide, you can see that this model is going to argue for an indirect path. What we mean by that is there are no arrows that go straight from the input variables to aggression. Rather, the arrows go through three what are called psychophysiological states and then to aggression. So once again, the general aggression model is not arguing for a direct relationship, a direct path between the input variables and aggression. Rather, the belief is the input variables impact something else, these three psychophysiological states, which then in turn impact aggression. So before we get into the specifics of the general aggression model, there's a couple of general comments that need to be made. The first of these is that if you take a look at the diagram, it shouldn't take you very long to figure out that I'm really going to like this model. One thing I say a lot in my classes, and I say a lot in my social psychology classes, and I've said in this class, is that I believe that the one great truth of psychology, the one thing that we have learned and understood more than anything else in the 100 plus years of this discipline, is that to understand human affect, behavior, and cognition, to figure out the ABCs of life, you have to simultaneously include in your analysis two things, the person and the situation. Leaving either the person out or the situation out, you're going to end up with an incomplete analysis. Well, by looking at the diagram, you should figure out, I like this model, because this model begins with personal and situational input variables. This model gets it. The general aggression model understands that you can't figure out why somebody is aggressive without looking at where they are, the situation, and who they are, the person. Leave either of those two things out, it will not be a complete or comprehensive understanding of aggression. The process of the general aggression model begins with two different types of input variables, situational input variables and personal input variables. The situational input variables are various aspects of the setting or environment that have an impact on the process of aggression, while the personal input variables are characteristics and traits of the individuals that involve and impact aggression. In its original form, the frustration-aggression hypothesis argued that frustration always leads to aggression, and aggression always comes from frustration. Well, the problem with that version of this hypothesis is that we know that in psychology there are no guarantees, so use of the word always is always a bad idea for a theory. It took them about 2 years to restate this approach, and they said that frustration often leads to aggression, and aggression often comes from frustration. So what they're saying really is that when we're frustrated, it doesn't guarantee that we'll act aggressively, but it just stacks the deck in the favor of aggression, and that aggression doesn't only come from frustration, but frustration is one of the key facilitators or antecedents of aggression. One of the more interesting studies on de-individuation was conducted a couple of decades ago by Diener. And what this researcher did was he enlisted the help of families out in Seattle on Halloween. What they did was they looked to see if the trick-or-treaters showed up either alone or in groups. So that was one subject variable, either they came by themselves or they were trick-or-treating with their friends. And then the other variable was an independent variable where some of the trick-or-treaters, either those that were alone or in the group, they were de-individuated. They were left de-individuated in their costumes and their outfits. And they were just told, gosh, Batman, that's a cute outfit. And then that would be it. But in the individuated condition, they were told something like, gosh, Batman, that's a really cute outfit. What's your name and where do you live? So in the individuated condition, they were no longer anonymous. The setup was that they would have some candy in a bowl on the front porch, and after the homeowner would go through the whole introduction of who are you or not, the homeowner would then say, okay, please take one piece of candy, or in the group condition, please take one piece of candy each, and then they'd head back inside. Then they would come back out and they'd count how many pieces of candy were left. They always start with the same number, and so then they could figure out how much candy the individuals had taken. And what they found was when the individual was in a group setting versus alone, they took more candy because a group setting should lead to de-individuation. Also, when they were left anonymous, they weren't asked their name and where they were living. They again took more candy because by having high levels of anonymity, you can have high levels of de-individuation. And when the individuals were left anonymous and they were in groups, they took a lot of extra candy because that's a situation where the de-individuation would be the highest. So one of the more famous studies in social psychology was Bandura's Bobo doll study. His Bobo doll study was basically looking at the effect of modeling or observational learning on aggression. And as you probably have heard, this study basically involved kids watching other kids playing in a room. And some kids watched other kids go up to this doll, this like 3 or 4 foot high doll, looked like a clown, and kind of punch it and kick it as they walked by. Other kids saw other children in the room leaving the doll alone. When the kids were then placed into the room with that doll, those who had seen the other kids beat up the doll, they also would beat up the doll. They modeled or observationally learned the aggressive acts to be implemented against the Bobo doll. So Bandura's 4 steps to observational learning there would be attention, memory, ability, and motivation. You have to see what the individual did. You have to be able to remember what they did when your chance to engage in the behavior rolls around. You have to actually have the ability to do this, and then you have to have the motivation or the desire to do it. Think back to the movie Psycho. I don't know if you've seen this movie or not, but this is the Alfred Hitchcock classic thriller that has the very classic shower scene where the individual is stabbed to death, the lady is stabbed to death in the shower. So back in the 60s, 70s, this was a really popular, scary movie. And, individuals could potentially model or reproduce the behavior of, well, quite frankly, murdering somebody in a shower. Attention would be the first step, right? If they went to see this movie, was their attention directed at the screen when that behavior occurred? Had they stepped out for popcorn? Did they have to go to the bathroom? Did they miss seeing that scene? Or were they actually in the theater at that moment in time watching what happened during the shower scene? Memory is next. Their opportunity to reproduce the behavior is not going to occur right then, even if they saw it. Well, of course, unless they're actually watching this movie while in the shower, which is probably not a good idea. So the next time they have the opportunity to do this, they're at home and their wife is in the shower. Do they remember what happened in the movie? If they've forgotten it, then there's not going to be any observational learning. Ability. Does the individual actually have the ability to pick up a knife and stab somebody in a shower? So physical ability, intellectual ability, developmental ability, lack of psychological stability. And then there's motivation. So many people saw that movie and paid attention to the shower scene. So many people can remember that shower scene. It was really powerful, very salient, and was rammed into a lot of people's schemas. Most people have the ability to pick up a knife and walk into somebody's shower and start stabbing them. The thing is, people don't do it. That's why Bandura would say motivation was probably the most important step. Just because you saw it, you can remember it, and you can do it, doesn't mean you will. You have to have a motivation to harm the individual. Researchers have identified several situational input variables that can increase the likelihood of aggressive actions. Some of these are found in the diagram. This, of course, is not an exhaustive list. There are others out there, but to talk about all of them would take more time than we have. So what you see in the diagram are a listing of specific situational input variables I find interesting, and a description of each of these in a more detailed fashion will follow in the next couple of slides. The frustration aggression hypothesis, coming out in the 1930s, 1940s, basically says that aggression is facilitated by the frustration we feel when there's some goal that we have that's blocked. There's something that we want, there's some achievement that we want, there's some goal that we want, some accomplishment that we want, but we can't get it. And that frustration we feel based on the fact that we can't acquire or receive that goal leads to frustration. De-individuation is a psychological state that includes a loss of self-awareness and feelings of being anonymous. This occurs when we're a part of a group and we feel as though our identity is hidden. We feel like we can't be singled out. And when we feel like we can't be singled out, no one's going to know that we do it, we're more likely to engage in actions that we would not otherwise do. Sometimes this is referred to as a mob mentality. People that are part of mobs, these large gatherings, will do things because they think that they can hide in the mob. No one's going to know that it was me that did it. Therefore, I'm more likely to engage in actions that I wouldn't otherwise do. Although Bandura is certainly widely respected and known for his research on observational learning and is known for his work with the Bobo doll studies, I could make an argument that his greatest contribution to psychology wasn't simply in studying observational learning and modeling, but rather his understanding and description of the process of observational learning. He wasn't simply interested in showing that it happens. He also wanted to talk about how we learn through observation, including the process of how we learn aggression through observation. According to Bandura, there are 4 steps in the process of observational learning, including the observational learning of aggression. Step 1 is attention. Essentially what we're saying here is you have to have your attention directed toward the model when this individual engages in the aggressive act. If you didn't see what the model did, then you're not going to be able to reproduce this person's behavior. Our second step is memory. Here what is going on is the fact that when you see somebody do something, your opportunity to reproduce or model their behavior probably doesn't occur right then and there. There's often a time lag between when you saw what the person did and when your opportunity to reproduce the behavior shows up. Well, if when your opportunity comes to reproduce or model this individual's behavior, you can't remember what they did, then you're not going to have observational learning. Just because you saw it doesn't do you any good. You have to see it and be able to remember it. Our third step is ability. You have to have the ability to engage in the act. Just because you saw it and you can remember it doesn't mean you can do it. You have to have the ability. Ability being physical or emotional or intellectual or developmental, whatever. Can you actually engage in this behavior? And then the fourth step, you have to have the desire or the motivation to reproduce the behavior. Bandura would often argue that motivation was the key because we often see people do things, we can remember what they do, we have the ability to do what they do, but our motivation, this key fourth step in the process, is often lacking. Just think about it. How many aggressive acts do you notice over the course of a week? How many can you remember and how many can you do? It's a pretty decent number. How many of them do you do? Well, I'm hoping as your professor, it's not very many, right? Just because you saw it, you remember it, and you can do it, doesn't mean you will. You have to have the motivation. Some of the first studies to examine the impact of aggressive cues were conducted by Berkowitz, and these studies were often referred to as the weapons effect studies. In this research, individuals would be given an opportunity to shock a rude and sort of snotty Confederate, and they would do so in the place of an aggressive cue, a handgun, a revolver, or a non-aggressive cue, some other object. And what Berkowitz would find is they would be more aggressive in their shocks in the presence of an aggressive cue. It's important to remember that these cues weren't pointed out to the individuals, right? It's not like the subjects were told, oh, look, darn, I forgot to put my gun away again. They were just there in the environment, sort of in the background. It's important to note then that this is not a conscious process, right? This is more below the water line. This is where you're going to be primed by these cues at the automatic level. They're going to have an impact on your behavior, and you're not even necessarily going to be aware of it. Humans are highly social creatures, and we do not like being excluded socially. We do not like being shunned or pushed off to the side socially. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, we often use social exclusion as punishment. So for example, when kids get in trouble, the parents will ground them, which basically means we're going to make you go to your room or stay inside the house and you don't get to see your friends. In prisons, when people do really, really bad things, they're put into solitary confinement. Again, we're going to remove the social from your life. Social situations, social inclusion is so powerful and so important to people that we punish with exclusion. Given that, it shouldn't be surprising that when we are excluded, it can facilitate our aggression. An example of a study that has looked at the impact of social exclusion on aggression is a study that involves what's called cyberball. So if you look to the picture off the side here, you've got 3 individuals, 3 players, and one of these players would be the subject. The subject is going to believe that the other 2 players are also subjects, but in fact it's just computer generated. They think it's live, but it's not. And what the subject is told is you're going to get to play catch with your friends. And so, after the first, minute or so, they're just kind of throwing the ball back and forth, and player one throws it to player three, who throws it to two, and back to player one being the subject, and they're just kind of playing a nice game of catch. A minute or so in, all of a sudden, player two and player three don't let player one have the ball. They're not going to let him get involved in the reindeer games, so to speak, and player two and three just keep throwing it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. It's really interesting to watch this in action because now player one, this individual is going to feel socially excluded. And what they find is when they get to this point in the game, the level of aggression for these participants goes up really, really dramatically. Aversive incidents are simply aspects of our environment that make us uncomfortable. We just don't feel good in them. We get into a bad mental state. They're yucky to us. And so as a function of our discomfort, our level of aggression is facilitated. Three that they'll often study would be heat, really high temperatures, crowding, feeling that our personal space has been invaded, and then also noise, feeling that an environment is noisy and it's noise that we can't control, we can't do anything about it. It's for this reason that crowding and heat and noise often are associated with higher levels of aggression. They are aversive incidents. Another interesting situational input variable would be an aggressive cue. An aggressive cue is a person or a place or a thing that's consistently paired with, that is associated with aggression. So that when you encounter this person, place, or thing, what happens is schema that are related to aggression are then activated. Early on in his career, Freud didn't include Thanatos as a part of his personality theory. Rather, he was content just to stick with Eros, or this life preservation instinct. But as Freud saw the atrocities that humans could do to one another during World War I, he kind of decided that maybe there is a separate and equally powerful death and destruction instinct, so he came up with the notion of Thanatos. Thanatos originally says, okay, I want to destroy me. The whole point of Thanatos originally is to say, I want to be motivated towards self-destruction. But that's not going to work out very well. So Eros, this life instinct, says, okay, we've got to figure out a way to channel off and siphon off your aggressive urges in a way that doesn't hurt us. So Eros says to Thanatos, here's a really good idea. Why don't you redirect your aggressive and instinctual urges outwardly towards others? If you do that, then we still get to be we, and you can feel better about yourself and get rid of your aggression. So according to Freud then, people are aggressive because, well, they want to aggress towards themselves, but that's not going to be very effective, and so they rechannel that aggression outwardly towards other people. Although catharsis is a quite common aspect to many theories in psychology, particularly back in the early years of the 1900s with the instinctual models, the reality is the research just does not support this. In truth, there probably isn't a single theory in all of psychology that has more lay individuals believing in it than catharsis, but also has such an incredible lack of research support. So many people buy into the notion of catharsis, and yet the research just isn't there. This is true both for aggression catharsis and symbolic catharsis. There's no evidence that acting aggressively actually lowers your subsequent level of aggression. If anything, research shows it will increase the likelihood that you will subsequently act aggressively. Similarly, there's nothing to symbolic catharsis. People don't get lower levels of aggression when they watch other people act aggressively. It increases their likelihood of behaving aggressively through the process of observational learning and modeling. So somewhere in your notes where you have the words catharsis, just write the word bullshit, because really that's what this is. Similar to aspects of the situation, researchers have also identified several personal input variables, that is, traits or characteristics of people, that can increase the likelihood of aggressive actions. Now, these include the characteristics and traits found in the diagram, but remember, once again, this is not an exhaustive list. There are other traits and characteristics of people that impact aggression, but we don't have time to talk about all of them. One personal input variable that was really popular in the early decades of the 1900s were instincts. The instinctual approaches argue that humans, like all other animals, have an inborn, hardwired capacity to behave aggressively. Freud was a champion of this approach In fact, he often talked about eros, the life instinct, and thanatos, the death instinct. A common construct for many instinctual approaches was the notion of catharsis. Catharsis is simply defined as the reduction of aggression through aggression. And there are two types of catharsis: aggression catharsis and symbolic catharsis. Aggression catharsis is the reduction of aggression through one's own aggressive actions. So with aggression catharsis, I have these instinctual aggressive urges, and I'm going to siphon them off by acting aggressively in myself. Our second type of catharsis, symbolic catharsis, this is the reduction of aggression by watching the violent actions of others. So rather than getting rid of or siphoning off or reducing my aggressive urges through my own actions, I can also do this, I can also accomplish this by watching other people act aggressively. There are two explanations to help us understand why men tend to be more physically aggressive than women. One is a biological approach. This is simply the fact that through evolution, the acts of physical aggression have been evolved into the male gender. In most species, not all, but in most species, the aggressor is the male. And so if you're going to be successful and reproduce as a male, you're probably going to be aggressive, and therefore the aggressive gene gets evolved in. But also a second explanation is necessary, and that's a cultural explanation. Societies have very powerful gender roles. That is, there are certain aspects and behaviors that are acceptable for males and females that aren't acceptable for the other gender. In most societies, again, not all, but in most societies, aggression is much more consistent with the male gender role than the female gender role. For example, one of the more popular youth sports in the upper Midwest is high school women's hockey. And in high school women's hockey, there's no contact. You get in trouble for checking in hockey. You heard that correctly. You can't have contact in hockey. That's because of the gender roles and the notion that women aren't supposed to act physically aggressive. One way that alcohol can facilitate aggression is that alcohol can also serve as an aggressive cue. That is, in addition to the fact that alcohol can lower inhibitions and when coupled with threat can increase the likelihood of aggression just based on the consumption of alcohol, alcohol can also facilitate aggression simply because alcohol is often paired with aggression. That is, you can have higher levels of aggression related and associated with alcohol without the actual consumption of alcohol. When they've replicated some of the weapons effect studies we talked about earlier, where they would have individuals in the presence of an aggressive cue or a non-aggressive cue, and they would be given the opportunity to shock this rude or kind of snotty Confederate, the amount of increase in aggression based on the aggressive cue being a revolver or the aggressive cue being a bottle of alcohol, they found was not statistically significantly different. Both guns and alcohol containers equally increased the likelihood of aggression towards the Confederate. So alcohol also serves as an aggressive cue. Another way that alcohol can facilitate aggression is its impact on an attributional bias known as the intentionality bias. The intentionality attributional bias is the fact that we tend to think that what we do is based on accident, but what other people do is done on purpose, that they did it to us intentionally. So if you're walking in front of some people at a store and you accidentally step on somebody's foot, that's exactly what you think. I accidentally stepped on their foot. But if somebody else steps on our foot, we are far more likely to think that they did it on purpose. What they find is that alcohol intensifies the intentionality bias. Normally, we think people do things to us on purpose, but when we're drunk, we absolutely are convinced they did so. So if you can imagine some individuals at a very crowded bar. As somebody's walking across the bar and kind of moving through people, this person steps on someone's foot. If the person whose foot is stepped on is not drunk, they're still probably going to think there was some intention there because of the intentionality bias. But if they're drunk, they're absolutely going to be convinced that this person did it on purpose, and then they will respond aggressively, and you get the fight between these individuals. So the fact that they're drunk makes them convinced that the person did it on purpose. It increases the intentionality bias, and therefore ultimately increases the likelihood of aggression between these individuals. One of the most well-replicated findings in all of social psychology is the fact that males tend to be more physically aggressive than females. Notice I said physically aggressive. This isn't necessarily the case for other forms of aggression, such as bitterness or hostility or anger. But in terms of physical aggression, men consistently are more aggressive than women. During the prejudice lecture, a few lectures back when we were talking about sources or causes of prejudice, one of the ones we talked about was social identity theory, and a part of social identity theory being the self-esteem hypothesis. You may recall that the self-esteem hypothesis basically says that we can make ourselves feel better by slamming on or being derogatory towards or hostile or even aggressive towards outgroups. Part of the self-esteem hypothesis stated that it is threat, group threat, that leads us to derogation. That was one of the corollaries. Well, you're not going to feel threat towards a group if you don't care about that group. Unless you have high levels of group identification, if a group is put down, you're not going to care, right? So if you're a part of a fraternity and people start slamming on that fraternity, but you don't care about the fraternity, you just join because, well, you like the beer, then that's not going to be a threat to you and you're not going to aggress. So ultimately, one person factor is group identification. If you have high levels of group identification and that group is threatened, then based on the self-esteem hypothesis, you will derogate or aggress against outgroups. Study after study after study has found that alcohol facilitates aggression, particularly when alcohol is coupled with threat. So when the individual is threatened, then they happen to also be intoxicated, they're even more likely to respond in an aggressive fashion. But there are other reasons and other ways that alcohol facilitates aggression. This personal input variable is pretty straightforward. Simply put, people are more likely to aggress when they're in pain. You ever slammed your finger in a car door and it pissed you off so much that then you kicked the car and then your foot hurt more than your finger did? Yeah, that's because when we're in pain, we want something or someone to join us, and therefore we're more likely to aggress. So our first psychophysiological state would be arousal. And what's happening here is that the input variables, some of the situational and some of the personal, are going to end up increasing the individual's level of arousal. It's going to increase their heart rate or their blood pressure, their respiration, sweaty palms, things like this. Think about situations where you've been frustrated, a situational input variable. If you're frustrated, your heart races and your blood pressure goes up. Think about situations where you've been socially excluded. That probably also increases your arousal. Think about situations where your group has been shown to be inferior. You do this with group identification. Think about situations where you're experiencing pain. So you can think about these situational and personal input variables. Many of them will increase the individual's level of physiological arousal. The impact of arousal on aggression is best understood through Dolph Zillman's excitation transfer theory. When Zillman uses the word excitation, he just means arousal. So think of arousal transfer theory. What's happening here is that the arousal from one state can be transferred to a new state. So state one has arousal, but then there's leftover or residual arousal from state one, and that gets transferred to a second state. It intensifies then the affect and behaviors for that second state. For example, Zillman would have individuals ride an exercycle either really fast for 5 minutes in the high arousal state, or for like 5 seconds really slow in the low arousal state, have them do some quick 30, 60-second filler task, and then have them watch some movie. It would be like a short 5 or 6 minute video clip of an exciting movie or a scary movie or a pornographic movie. And what he found was that the individual's level of emotional response to the small short video clip was greater in the high arousal condition. The arousal from the exercycle task was transferred, the excitation was transferred to the second task, increasing their level of emotional response to that second task. So taking this back then to aggression, if these situational and personal input variables increase your arousal, and you then know that higher levels of arousal can be facilitating higher levels of emotion like hostility and anger, things that are associated with aggression, arousal then is an important psychophysiological state that increases aggression. So the personal and situational input variables could also have an impact on affect. In particular, we're talking here about negative affect, anger, for example. If you're frustrated, that probably has the ability to piss you off. So frustration can lead to negative affect. If you are in pain, that probably does the same thing. If you're in the presence of an aversive incident, that probably is making you angry. If your group has been shown to be inferior and you have a high level of identification with this group, you're probably going to be in a state of negative affect. So both the personal and situational input variables can lead to aggression through their impact on negative affect. One of the best ways to understand the impact of affect, in particular negative affect, on aggression is depicted through the cognitive neo-association theory, work of Berkowitz. Berkowitz was trying to figure out why the frustration aggression hypothesis didn't work out very well. It sure seems straightforward. People are frustrated and then they get aggressive. But that's not always the case, right? I mean, sometimes people get frustrated and they act aggressively and sometimes they don't. What Berkowitz thought was maybe there's a missing piece in here. Maybe what's going on is that if the frustration leads to anger, this negative affective state, then you're going to get a heightened level of aggression. But if the frustration leads to something else, then you don't get the aggression. That's exactly what happens. So his cognitive neo-association theory kind of helps us understand what's going on here with respect to the input variables, affective state, and aggression. If these input variables lead to a negative affective state, then they're going to lead to a heightened level of aggression. If not, you're not going to get this increased chance of aggressive action. With respect to cognition, all we're saying here is that sometimes situational and personal input variables can increase the likelihood that we're thinking in aggressive ways, that our thoughts are aggressive in nature. Again, if you're talking about modeling or aggressive cues or social exclusion or alcohol or pain, it's pretty easy to understand how when somebody is experiencing these things, their thinking, their cognitions are more likely to be aggressive in nature. The impact of the input variables on cognitive processes can best be seen in the priming effect. The priming effect is the fact that sometimes individuals can be exposed to a stimulus, a person or a place or an object or a thing or whatever, and exposure to this object automatically, subconsciously, activates a schema. It primes the schema. They aren't aware of it. It's below the waterline, as they say. They aren't aware of it. It's the subconscious level. But yet it automatically activates the schema. And by doing so, it can have impacts on other actions and thoughts and behaviors and affect that they have. So with respect to cognition and the general aggression model, certain different types of input variables can automatically open up a schema, can prime the schema. And then when our schemas related to aggression are primed, we're more likely then to interpret the world in an aggressive fashion and then be more likely to respond to situations in an aggressive fashion. As was stated earlier, according to the general aggression model, the situational and personal input variables do not have a direct effect on aggression. Rather, they work through the psychophysiological states. That is, the input variables are going to impact the psychophysiological states, which then in turn will impact aggression. The three psychophysiological states are arousal, affect, and cognition. The final component of the general aggression model is the individual's appraisal of the environment. So far, what's happening is that you have these situational and personal input variables that have worked their way through these psychophysiological states, the arousal, the affect, and the cognition, and that's now set the stage for aggression. But just because somebody has a high level of arousal and they have a negative affective state and they've been primed to think about aggressive actions, that doesn't guarantee that they're going to act in an aggressive fashion. In psychology, there are no guarantees. And one reason that they might not is because of their appraisal of the environment. Let's say you have somebody who is late for an interview and they're late because their kid, they found out that their child used their best suit to clean up his paints from the day before. So they had to find a different suit to wear. And they also found out that their older child used up all the gas, so they had to go get gas. And they're late, and traffic is terrible. So they've got this negative affect thing going. They're highly aroused. They're pissed off. They've been listening to really violent music on the way there, so they're primed for aggression. They're just set up, right? And they're in traffic behind this person, and this person's at a stoplight. The stoplight turns green, and the person in front of them doesn't go. Now you're going to say, yeah, that person's going to honk the horn. They're going to cuss at him. They're going to say a whole bunch of words that rhyme with truck. The odds are pretty good, yes, because the stage is set for aggression. But what if they're in the car and seated next to them is their pastor? Or the parents are in the car of the girl that they're dating? They may appraise their environment and decide, yeah, I might want to act on this stuff, but I better not in this situation. It's also important to point out that this appraisal may or may not be conscious, right? It may be something that they aren't even aware they're doing, but yet it still shuts them down. Also, the appraisal could be something that increases their likelihood of acting aggressively. They see their environment as being free of any reason to not act aggressively. So there's no police around, there's no security around, so time to rock and roll. Certainly, there's no guarantee that appraisal happens. I think that the show Cops is a function of the fact that people sometimes don't appraise a situation. The simple fact is, however, sometimes people look around and say, I better not do this, at least not right now, because of the situation, the environment that I'm in.